Remember when I talked to you last about going far, far back in time? We went back to a time when the whole universe was created with a bang, and then we talked about how the earth was created. And then we talked about the time of the volcanoes, and then finally we talked about how the rains came and how the warm, murky, shallow sea was formed. Now let's go back to that story and see where we can go from there. Remember that I told you that the warm, shallow sea covered most of the surfaces of the earth and the water was rich in minerals from the volcanic ash? The sea also had some places where rocks struck out, making islands from small to very large. There were no plants, there was no life on the earth, and there was no life in the water. There was no soil or dirt on the earth, just rocks. And in that silent sea, in that quiet ocean, nothing lived. Nothing lived on the rocks or stones or in the lakes or in the atmosphere. There was no movement, there was no sound. The atmosphere was thin so that things from outer space could come in dust, rays, and meteorites. The waters were warm, rich in minerals, and set just perfectly for life, but there was no life. Now, we don't know exactly why this happened, and we don't know exactly how this happened, but inside that warm, nurturing, mineral-rich water, bathed in rays and materials coming in from space, yet contained within the safety of our planet, something happened. Something began to move. I don't know how many times this movement might have happened. Maybe whatever it was that moved had lived for a short time and then died, and maybe 1,000,000 years later that happened again. And maybe it happened many times. We don't know. We do know that eventually something moved and kept moving. And this something was life. Life. People don't actually know how it happened. Some say it just happened. Some say God made it happen. Some say it was destined to happen. Some say that there were waves and materials coming in from outer space, and something in those materials and forces needed the ocean. We really don't know for sure. But we do know that it did happen. This is what we do know for sure, that somehow, some way, something began to move there in the water. The earliest form of life was only a little tiny, 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 tiny cell, so small you couldn't have even seen it without a microscope. We really don't know what the first living things were like. Life may have begun at deep underwater hot springs that spewed hydrogen-rich molecules. Another idea is that life started because of comets that brought energy and caused chemical reactions, producing chemicals essential to life. Or maybe life started with small molecules that interacted with each other. These may have been enclosed in simple cases, like the outsides of cells. Still, other people believe that some early life may even have been remotely plant-like, or that there were simply forces that we can't understand at work. Eventually, as life evolved, it began to gain its energy by basking in the light of the sun. The sun shone on it and it gained energy. There were minerals available, and with the sun's energy, life could form food. At some point, the living things felt within itself a pull, a pulling apart, a pull that caused it to almost tear in two. In fact, it did split in two, and both of its halves were still alive. And that happened again and again, and that's how it reproduced. And that's how life grew, by splitting in two again and again. It was as if life had felt a command to reproduce, divide, make young, and that is exactly what happened. This is our timeline of life. This is where our story continues, with the very first plants and animals that formed in the seas. I want you to notice as you observe the timeline, the red lines. Those are the lifelines of the different species that have lived during this time period. We're going back to the ancient time period. At the beginning of this is with the Cambrian period. That was part of the Paleozoic era. I want you to notice these funny looking creatures going up the side. Those are called trilobites. We also had wonderful creatures like jellyfish even, which we still have today. Sea sponges and bivalves. Bivalves are things like scallops and oysters, similar to that. There's sea worms and other kinds, echinoderms, and the beginning early forms of crustaceans. I want you to notice too the big ice age that occurred. And you move to the next period of the Ordovician period. And you can see horseshoe crabs, which are still today, giant sea scorpions and cephalopods, starfish, and even sand dollars. There are also other creatures living in the ocean, creatures that look like plants but really are animals, such as our crinoids and the beginning of the early sea lilies. Up on land, there is a great uplift of mountains, and as a result, the beginning of insects with your first millipedes. Towards the end of this time period, the coral reefs were forming in our ocean. And at the very closest next to the Ice Age, we began to see the beginning of fish forming in the oceans. Somehow, a plant decided that it could live and float on top of the water, and then it decided to lift its head above the water and felt the warmth of the sun. And it discovered that it could live above the water. This is where we began to see the beginning of marsh plants making its way onto the land. Our oceans were teeming with all kinds of new life. We had the beginning of the first fish. Some of them developed armor to protect themselves, and eventually they died off. But they were taken over by modern-day type fish, fish that had bones and cartilage. We also had cephalopods change their shell shape. Instead of being straight, they became spiraled. In the Carboniferous period, we see a huge growth in the fish, but something else happened in the seas. Something somewhere decided that it could live both in the water and poke its head out, and decided it could breathe using lungs. So a creature that had both gills and lungs became the very first amphibians on Earth. On the land, we had a huge growth of plants. Giant cycad trees and ferns were starting to grow. And as a result, it gave way to the growth of insects. Within the swamps and the plant growth, and as they died, they would fall into the swamp. And then the pressure in the earth, as it layers and layers laid on top, it began to form the beginning of our coal and iron deposits. Coal has been a very important resource for us in that it provides a source of energy. And then finally, as you get to the Permian period, there's another ice age, but we begin to see more and more land animals, the beginning of our reptiles. We're now entering into the Mesozoic era, the age of the reptiles, or as you probably know, the age of the dinosaurs. The reptiles in this time period grew to enormous sizes. They lived in the water and they lived on land, and they also took to the sky as birds. Dinosaurs are classified into two categories, either by the fact they are similar to reptiles, or some dinosaurs had the bone structure of that of a bird. Eventually, the dinosaurs did become extinct. Nobody really knows for sure how or why. One theory is that a giant meteor hit the earth and the dust that it created blocked out the sun and they died. Some people theorize that the dinosaurs were so large they just couldn't adapt anymore to their environment, and eventually they died out. We will be spending more time learning about dinosaurs this year. I want to point out, as we finish the Mesozoic era, we begin to see the beginnings of flowering plants and modern-day insects. And eventually, that will lead to the very next time in our timeline. And now we have reached the Cenozoic era, the time where mammals began to appear on the earth. Very much similar to the type of mammals that we have today. The Eohippus and the Mesohippus were the earliest forms of the horse. We still had fish, just like we have had in the oceans. Our very first whales and the first elephants appeared. Ancient antelopes and modern-day birds flew in the sky. It was an amazing time on Earth. We also started to see the very first flowering plants that could produce fruit. And then, something amazing happened. A brand new creation appeared on earth, the beginning of mankind. Mankind has been around for over 1,000,000 years and has continued to be on the earth today. And it's amazing all the accomplishments and the changes that we've seen. We will continue our story of life next with the story of man. I hope you've enjoyed the story of the coming of life. I hope you've learned a little bit of something from it. We will be going back and exploring this in greater detail later.